Hello, fellow Planeswalkers, it's Scott, and we're back for day 7 of Wild Eldraine spoilers. We got a lot of interesting cards to talk about today, but before we do that, thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring this video and all of our Wild Eldraine spoiler videos. So let's dig into today's spoilers. So first we've got Goddric Cloaked Reveler for 1 and 2 red mana. You get a Human Noble, that's a 3/3 with haste. So right there, kind of on level par with what we would expect from a 3 mana spell. So another potentially good card for mono red. It also has Celebration, and as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, Goddric Cloaked Reveler is a dragon with base power and toughness for 4 flying, and for 1 red mana, dragons you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So that's a kind of interesting, if you can get 2 cards in on the same turn, then you play, then you've got the ability to take extra mana and pump it into all the dragons. And we're already seeing a couple of dragons in the mono red deck, so that ability could very easily be an ability that leads to ending games very quickly if you can activate it a couple of times throughout the course of a game. So I think this is a card that Mono Red will be definitely looking at to include in its build for Wilds of Eldraine. Next, we've got Sentinel of Lost Lore for 1 and 2 green mana. You get an Elf Knight, that's a 3/4. And when Sentinel of Lost Lore enters the battlefield, choose 1 or more. Return target card you owned in exile that has an adventure to your hand. Put target card you don't own in exile that has an adventure on the bottom of its owner's library, and exile target player's graveyard. So this is a very, very good card, generally speaking, because it has these nice abilities that don't cost anything. So getting to return 1 of your adventure cards to your hand so you can recast the adventure side of it, putting 1 of your opponent's card that has an adventure on the bottom of their deck is another fine ability. Taking away that ability to put the creature in play is very damaging potentially to your opponent and their game plan. And then obviously exiling your target player's graveyard is a very good ability. And the fact that you don't have to pay any additional mana for this, I think makes it very, very playable in Standard. It'll certainly be a sideboard card in green decks, and it probably has some main deck ability in the right shell. Next, we've got Yenna, Redtooth Regent for 2, a green and a white mana. You get a legendary creature that's an elf noble and is a 4/4. And for 2 mana, you can tap Yenna and choose target enchantment you control that doesn't have the same name as another permanent you control. Create a token that's a copy of it, except it isn't legendary. If the token is an aura, untap Yenna, Redtooth Regent, then scry 2. Activate only as a sorcery. I can see this ability being very good in the Selesnya Enchantments deck because you can copy all of your creatures or your sagas or even your enchantment creatures. So I think there's a lot of application there, and I think this might be just what that deck needs to give it enough of a boost to be a little bit more competitive in Standard. Next, we've got Devouring Sugarmaw for 2 and 2 black mana. You get a horror that's a 6/6. It has Menace and Trample, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token. If you don't, tap Devouring Sugarmaw. So it's an interesting card. You got to have things to sacrifice to keep it untapped. And I think, in a devoted deck that has food in it, you can do that. But if you don't, then I think this is going to be a hard card to see a lot of play in Standard. It does have an adventure, have for dinner for 1 and a white mana. You get to create a 1/1 human creature token and a food token. So right there, that might be enough to make this card playable in certain decks in Orzhov or Esper Shells. But that requirement of having to sacrifice an enchantment, an artifact, or a token every turn, basically is the bargain ability for every turn. And while it's 6/6, I think there are other things that we already have in Standard that don't see a lot of play that have similar abilities that you don't have the downside of having to bargain for it every single turn to keep it from tapping. Next, we've got Heartflame Duelist for 1 and a white mana. You get a Human Knight. That's a 3/1. It has an ability, instants and sorcery spells you control have lifelink. So a very powerful ability on Heartflame Duelist. So why is this important? Well, we've already got a number of burn spells in Standard that we definitely see play. Now, in addition to that, her adventure is Heartflame Slash for 2 and a red mana. You get an instant, and Heartflame Slash deals 3 damage to any target. So the only problem with this, I think it's kind of backwards. You would like to have been able to cast the instant before you cast the Heartflame Duelist, but playing Heartflame Duelist on turn 2 and then playing other burn spells on turn 3 can be really helpful in a Boros deck or any number of decks that we might see in Standard. So it definitely has some Standard playability. Again, the key here is going to be finding the right shell for the card to be successful in. Next, we've got Gruff Triplets. For 3 and 3 green mana, you get a Satyr Warrior. That's a 3/3 with Trample. And when Gruff Triplets enter the battlefield, if it isn't a token, create 2 tokens that are copies of it. When Gruff Triplet dies, put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to its power on each creature you control named Gruff Triplet. So for 6 mana, that's a lot of mana, but you're getting 3 bodies and 9 power across the 3 bodies. But what's more important is when one of them dies, you get to take, assuming that you haven't put any other counters on it, you get to put 3 counters on each of your remaining Gruff Triplets, so making them 6/6s the next time they attack. And then when the next one dies, your final one becomes a 9 or becomes a 12/12 when it is the last one on the board. So the scalability here I think is really good and interesting in terms of, you know, just flavor and mechanics. So I think this has some Standard playability. Again, we're going to have to find the right deck for it, because right now we understand that green is not a very powerful color in Standard in its current form. So we'll have to see if there's a deck that can take advantage of this ability and maybe bring green back to Standard as a viable color. Next, we've got some of our lower rarity cards of the day. So first we have Cheeky House Mouse for 1 white mana. It's a 2/1, and it has an adventure, Squeak By, for 1 white mana, and target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It cannot be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater this turn. So kind of an interesting kind of combination. 2/1 for a 1-drop is a good rate in white. I mean, we're already seeing 2/1s for that get play across multiple colors. So I think the card itself is definitely playable in Standard. The question is there a deck that's going to want it? Now, we know that as we move into next year, we're going to have a plane that is devoid of humans, and Mouse Warriors are going to be something on that. So I think maybe this one has more Standard playability down the road, but in any kind of white deck where you can take advantage of this adventure that's a sorcery and having a 2/1 on the field, I think that will make it playable potentially. Next, we've got Solidarity Sanctuary. For 2 and a white mana, you get an enchantment, and when Solidarity Sanctuary enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. Whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this is another card I think that was meant to go in the Hilda deck. So I think based on what we're seeing right now, we got Hilda's Crown over the weekend. So I think there's enough cards that in a dedicated Hilda deck where you're playing all in on tapping down your opponent's creatures, then I think this is a good card for that particular deck. In Limited, both of these cards are very good and will be very helpful to you when it comes to trying to win your Limited games. Next, we've got Kellen's Light Slash. For 1 and a white mana, you get an instant with Bargain, and Kellen's Light Slash deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. If this spell was Bargain, destroy that creature instead. So I think this is a decent card in terms of playability in Standard, in white decks, because the ability to bargain and destroy that creature that's attacking or blocking. So if your opponent blocks with their Sheoldred, you can use this, if you can bargain for it, to go ahead and destroy your opponent's Sheoldred before it takes out your creature. So I think there's some standard viability there. Certainly in Limited, this is a very good card, and you'd want to include it in any white deck you're playing as removal in that format. Next, we've got Freeze in Place. For 1 and a blue mana, you get a sorcery. It says tap target creature an opponent controls and put 3 stun counters on it, and scry 2. Again, another card that in Limited is a very good card, and more importantly, in that Hilda deck, I think this is a card that is going to be a core piece of that, because you're going to be able to tap down your opponent's creatures and keep them tapped down for an extended period of time. Next, we've got a couple of fairies for the day. The first is Mocking Sprite. For 2 and a blue mana, you get a Fairy Rogue. That's a 2/1 with flying. And instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So the inclusion of that secondary ability of instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, I think is a nice ability to have on this. But again, it's a common, and it's a 3 mana for a 2/1. We just saw a card in white that is 1 mana for a 2/1 mouse. So I think the rate here is a little bit high for the card. If it was 2 mana, I think it would be a better card. But again, if the fairy deck ends up with a lot of instants and sorceries in it, then probably this is a card you'd want a couple of. Otherwise, it's pretty much a limited playable card. Next, we have Picklock Prankster. For 1 and a blue mana, you get a Fairy Rogue with flying and vigilance, and is a 1/3. And it comes with an adventure, Free the Fae. For 1 and a blue mana, it's an instant, and you mill 4 cards, then put an instant sorcery or fairy card from among the mill cards into your hand. So nice, basically you're going to mill 4 cards and you get to put 1 of them in your hand. So we've got a number of effects that do similar things, but usually you put the cards on the bottom of your library rather than into the graveyard. But it's the same basic effect where we're going to be able to take an instant sorcery or a fairy in this case and put it in your hand. So pretty decent ability. And again, if we do get a fairy deck, I think that this is a card that certainly could fit into that shell. Next, we've got Spell Stutter. For 1 and a blue mana, you get an instant, counter target spell unless its controller plays 2 plus an additional 1 for each fairy you control. So I think this is, at least from the set so far, is definitely the best counter spell that we've gotten. Fairies obviously are an archetype that is a core part of this set. So in Limited, this will be a very good card and probably can shut down almost anything. And if you are playing a dedicated fairy deck, then this means that it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mana that your opponent would have to pay to prevent their spell from being countered. And in that case, I think it's a pretty good spell. Next, we have Water Wings. For 1 and a blue mana, you get an instant, and until end of turn, target creature you control has base power and toughness 4/4 and gains flying and hexproof. So again, nice and limited, probably doesn't have any at all standard playability. Next, we got a couple of red cards. Boundary Land Ranger. For 1 and a red mana, you get a human ranger. That's a 2/2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So again, this is really a limited card. It doesn't have much standard playability at all. Next, we have Furious Firebolt. For 2 and a red mana, you get an instant, and Furious Firebolt deals X damage to target creature, where X is equal to 2 plus a number of cards in your graveyard that are an instant card, a sorcery card, or have an adventure. So kind of interesting combination of things that activate additional damage. But again, outside of Limited, this doesn't have really any playability because we simply have better stuff than this for 3 mana. Next, we have Graceful Takedown. For 1 and a green mana, you get a sorcery. Any number of target enchanted creatures you control and up to 1 other target creature you control each deal damage equal to their power to target creature you don't control. So I really like this card. Again, this is a card that I think is really meant to be played in an enchantment deck where all of those enchanted creatures, that whether it's through rolls or other enchantments, then you can basically stack their power and take out probably any creature that your opponent has on the battlefield. So pretty unique way to do this kind of effect, where we see green fight effects like this all the time, but it's usually one of your creatures deals damage to one of their creatures. So the fact that you can stack a number of creatures together to get to where you want to, I think makes it a very viable card, and in an enchanted deck has definite standard playability. Next we have Up the Beanstalk. For 1 and a green mana, you get an enchantment, and when Up the Beanstalk enters the battlefield, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. So for 2 mana, you get to draw a card. In green, that's a decent rate for drawing a card, and then you get the upside of the once you get in the latter parts of the game, then you're probably casting spells with mana 5 area or greater, and then you can get additional card draw at that point. So I think in the right deck, this has standard playability. Next, we have Welcome to Sweet Tooth. For 1 and a green mana, you get a saga. On Chapter 1, create a 1/1 white human creature token. On Chapter 2, create a food token. And then on Chapter 3, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of foods you control. So I think this is a definitely, in a food deck, a very viable strategy to do in standard, because worst case scenario is you end up, for your 2 mana, you get a 2/2 white human creature, assuming that it is the only thing that ends up being on the field at that point. But if you've got it in a dedicated food deck, it could be 4 or 5 +1/+1 counters, and then we're really making a creature pretty powerful. And if you can put that on something that's got trample, then you've got a creature that can go over and beat down your opponent. So I think there's some standard playability in this, and it will be interesting to see kind of where it fits into standard. Next, we've got some more adventure cards for the day. And next, we've got Spellscorn Coven. For 3 and a black mana, you get a Fairy Warlock with flying. That's a 2/3. And when Spellscorn Coven enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. So nice discard ability. We've seen a number of discard spells throughout the spoiler season in black, and this is just another example of that on a body. Now it also has an adventure, Take It Back. That's an instant for 2 and a blue mana, and you can return target spell to its owner's hand. Okay, this is Divide by Zero without a learn on it. And Divide by Zero, for those of you who are not familiar with that card, was from Strixhaven, and it actually got banned because of its power level. So I think this is probably a good card on its own, just for the Take It Back portion of the card, because it basically forces your opponent to have to recast that particular creature. While it doesn't have the learn mechanic, it does have obviously the Spellscorn Coven for 3 and a black mana that you could potentially cast on the next turn, and then, or even that turn. And potentially, if that's the last card in your opponent's deck, you can force your opponent to discard it, and then you've basically countered that spell and have a 2/3 body on the battlefield as a result of that. So I think there's some, again, potential for standard playability, particularly if our fairy deck is a black and blue deck. And based on what we're seeing from fairy so far, I think that's where the fairy deck will go. Next, we have Stormkeld Vanguard. For 4 and 2 green mana, you get a giant warrior. That's a 6/6, and Stormkeld Vanguard cannot be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. So decent body, but I think what's going to make this card or break this card is its adventure, which is Bear Down. For 1 and a green mana, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So I see this as any green deck probably wants enchantment and or artifact removal in its sideboard. So rather than just having one card that does that, you can have Stormkeld Vanguard in your sideboard. You can use the adventure side, and then late in the game, when you run out of cards, you've got this on adventure that you can then cast and put a big creature on the board. That could be the difference in winning and losing a game. So I think this is a very viable card in standard. Next, we've got our last couple of cards of the day. First, we have Prophetic Prism for 2 mana. You get an artifact, and when Prophetic Prism enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card. So 2 mana, draw a card. Again, a rate that we've been talking about a little bit earlier today in green. Here's an artifact that does the exact same thing. And for 1 mana, you can tap it and add 1 mana of any color. So this is a card that's designed to filter mana for you to get the mana that you need in a particular situation. Now, is it good enough to play in standard? No, but in limited, I think it's a pretty good card because its ability to draw a card and then become a mana filter for you, I think, is a very nice ability. Our last card of the day is Tempest Heart. For 3 and a green mana, you get an Elemental Elk. That's a 3/4 with Trample. And whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Tempest Heart. So again, that idea, you got to have these very, very expensive spells to get these activated abilities. So while it has Trample, I think it's a decent card, but it's probably, that side of it on its own is not standard playable. Now, Scan the Clouds for 1 and a blue mana is an instant that's an adventure. You get to draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. So this filtering ability might matter in a game. So if you're playing a deck that is using both blue and green, want some card filtering, then maybe this has got some standard playability. Certainly in limited, it's a good card, and you're likely to get 1 or more counters put on it as you're casting larger spells towards the end of the game. All right, those are our spoils for Monday from Wilds of Eldraine. So we'll be back tomorrow with more spoilers from the Wilds of Eldraine. And remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout the Wilds of Eldraine spoiler season. Thanks. I'll see you tomorrow.